Welcome again to another presentation of the DonPotter.net website. We're going to be reading, a second part of the case for the prosecution, Chapter 2, in the trial of the silent reading comprehension test charged with the destruction of American schools by Geraldine Rodgers. The title of this chapter is Why Should Anyone in His Right Mind Want to Teach Sight Words Anyway? And we're starting where we left off on the last paragraph on page 22. In the spring of 1908, James went to Columbia University to give lectures on pragmatism, his philosophy, on which John Dewey is presumed to have based his own. The Encyclopedia Britannica said that it was as though a new prophet had arrived. His lectures were crowded from first to last with people overflowing outside the room. Photographs were taken of James and parties were given. In his own words, James talked of the visit as the high tide of my existence. So it seems probable that there were those in Columbia in 1908 who agreed with James that there can be no consciousness but only matter. Concerning free will, for a 1908 book, Essays Philosophical and Psychological, in honor of William James, Edward L. Thorndike, who had been James's student about 12 years before at Harvard, wrote a chapter with this interesting title, A Pragmatic Substitute for Free Will. Thorndike said he had managed to discuss the subject, quote, without any need for going against or even beyond the scientific, matter-of-fact point of view and habit of interpreting the universe, end quote, and within the bounds of distinctive responses and the habits built upon them. Edward L. Thorndike was an enormously influential man. He was acknowledged in the 1948 book Theories of Learning by Ernest R. Hilgard, in which Hilgard said that Thorndike's theory of learning had been the dominant one in America for 50 years. In a stimulus-response psychology like Thorndike's, the entire mind is seen as a printed circuit, neither more nor less, just like the circuit of the infamous little triangle on reading. Such a theory makes no distinction between consciousness and the automatic levels of the human mind. It's interesting to see how this printed circuit psychology looks when discussed by another expert this time, Dr. Frank N. Freeman, then of the University of Chicago, who reviewed in the Elementary School Journal of June 1922 Thorndike's 1922 book, The Psychology of Arithmetic. Freeman wrote, this book is the author's definition of arithmetic in terms of the new psychology. Among these psychological principles, the most general and prominent is the bond concept. In the author's view, learning consists of the formation of bonds or connection between situations and responses. These bonds can be analyzed into groups of very minute and simple connections, and a complex activity is simply a collection of a large number of elementary bonds. The higher mental processes are reducible to exactly the same kinds of bonds as the simplest motor responses. And, quote, habit rules in the realm of thought as truly and fully as in the realm of action, end quote. There is therefore no fundamental distinction between reasoning, analysis, abstraction, etc., and the acts of skill. The theory provides no cement by which the bonds may be united to explain the process of organization of thought. Now back to Miss Rodgers. So the organization of thought bothered Freeman, which of course is just a roundabout way of talking about consciousness. One of the psychologists of the general period, the Englishman Charles Spearman, had proposed in 1904 that there was such a thing as general factor, G factor, in intelligence, so that intelligence was not a lot of splintered potential abilities. But in Thorndike's March 1921 article on the organization of intelligence, he doubted Spearman's theory. When these people came up with the explanation for the scores like Miss Milton's Wiley Guy rating, silent reading comprehension scores reported in 1915, they did agree with Binet that reading comprehension was potentially controlled by native intelligence, but the native intelligence itself was just a bunch of splintered potential abilities, each of which had to be developed independently. There was, after all, according to Thorndike, no such thing as transfer of learning. Wavering attention could not be the cause of fluctuating comprehension scores in classes like Miss Milton's, because if there were no such thing as consciousness or will, there could be no such thing as voluntary attention. The experts had a better and really scientific explanation. Why, the little kids in Miss Milton's 3rd and 4th grade class were, after all, just a bunch of robots like R2-D2. So it was obvious that their printed circuits were not operating efficiently in the little computers that they had tucked between their ears, their brains. It was because of that awful stuff called phonics, which kept stopping the kids at oral on the reading triangle printed circuit, so that they had frequently did not complete the trip to the meeting. Phonics had to go! Exclamation. By then they found out by actual experimental proof that there were two kinds of readers in people of normal hearing. Whole word readers who went counterclockwise on the triangle right to the meaning, guessing from the context in the process and sometimes making errors. On the other hand, highly accurate syllable readers who went counterclockwise straight to the sound on the triangle, where the experts were afraid they frequently were stopped. So the experts are determined to try to develop whole word counterclockwise readers to use only what Francisco Valles in the 17th century called the opposite way, the path of deaf mutes, and wrongly taught deaf mutes, that is. The thing that apparently really sparked a change in reading methods and brought about those awful 1930 and 1931 readers of Gray and Gates was a study of the reading vocabulary of children reported by Myrtle Schulte in February 1912 in an elementary school journal, which is available on my website, thanks to Miss Rodgers. Schulte's study really must have been a bombshell, which is why I'm convinced that it was so effectively buried that no one today has heard of it. W.S. Gray forgot to mention it in the body of his famed 1925 Summary of Reading Research of that day, just listing it in the index, and with the wrong description. Myrtle Schulte had worked with 3 little girls halfway through 2nd grade, probably 1911, flashing at high speed the 1,588 words they had been taught by then in their sight word readers. Which readers had been supplemented with diluted phonics, University of Chicago Laboratory School, which the girls attended. Against their will at that time, the laboratory schools had to teach supplemental phonics, or children could not remember enough sight words. Of the words little children could not read, Schulte found that 2 of the 3 girls were at least able to get to the beginning sounds of a large percentage correctly. Yet the 3rd girl was unable to read words in parts, but could only read whole words. Nevertheless, she had managed to read correctly 977 of the total 1,588 words, about the same as the other 2 girls. So, the experts obviously conclude that she had managed to do without supplemental phonics, the clockwise route on the triangle that they so hated, which stopped first at oral or sound before going to meaning. So they also knew that it is impossible for most children to remember more than a limited number of sight words without some kind of analysis. So they assumed that the 3rd little girl must have been using a different method, comparing the whole meaning-bearing sight words in her memory to another meaning-bearing sight word in order to tell them apart. So that was also the same as the visual analysis of meaning-bearing sight words taught to deaf mutes in Gaudet's approach. So intrinsic phonics was invented, which goes only the counterclockwise route and compares whole word-bearing sight words to each other in order to see like parts. Since intrinsic phonics always has to go through meaning first, the meaning of the sight word before it can get to the sound stop oral, if indeed it ever gets the oral sound stop. They believed intrinsic phonics protected reading comprehension. Schulte was also impressed by the fact that all 3 girls, not just the whole word reader, knew far more words in context than out of context. This showed that even those laboratory schoolgirls who could use supplementary phonics did not use it all the time, that's the clockwise, but sometimes went counterclockwise through meaning, the context of the selection for word identification. With the triangle plus Schulte studied the mystifying remarks about intrinsic phonics and the necessity of reading for meaning, which were made continually by W.S. Gray and Arthur I, suddenly made sense. The triangle plus Schulte studies provided what Charles C. Fries in Linguistics and Reading 1962 said is missing in reading research, a thread of continuity of basic assumptions. However, the triangle and Schulte study also provide an explanation for why they had were buried for 70 years. If children going clockwise with phonics are stopped on oral and do not go to meaning, then other children going counterclockwise to meaning may get stopped there and not go to the oral, the sounds of the words. They may, in other words, read inaccurately and spell badly. Just as phonics trained children, or so they thought, might not understand what they read but would read accurately. After all, Schulte did say the children depended most upon phonics read with fewer errors than the ones who read by word holes. The triangle plus Schulte study presented a distinct public relations problem for the early experts, which they apparently handled by bearing both the triangle and Schulte study, as the public might not like the price to be paid for reading with meaning, which price is stumbling, inaccurate oral reading, and bad spelling. The three little girls that Schulte worked with have